What happens when a crime is committed by someone who may not fully understand the reality of what they are doing? Hello everyone, I'm Ishika Shrivastava, a forensic science student and a volunteer at Shivi Forensics. In this video, we'll examine the John Hinckley Jr. case not simply as an attempted assassination but through the lens of forensic psychology, legal insanity, and criminal responsibility. The case began on the afternoon of March 30, 1981, when President Ronald Reagan was leaving the Washington Hilton Hotel after addressing a conference. Among the crowd was a 25-year-old man named John Hinckley Jr., who fired 6 shots from a revolver. President Reagan was wounded along with 3 others. What made this case extraordinary was not only the identity of the target, but what investigators discovered about the shooter's psychological state and motivation. John Hinckley Jr. was born in Oklahoma in 1955 and came from a financially stable family. But behind that apparently ordinary background was a growing pattern of social withdrawal and depression. One of the most important elements in understanding Hinckley's psychology was his obsession with actress Jodie Foster. After repeatedly watching the film Taxi Driver, Hinckley developed the belief that an extraordinary act would gain Foster's attention. His thinking became increasingly detached from ordinary social reality. He wrote letters to Foster and began constructing a personal narrative in which the assassination attempt would somehow prove his devotion and make him significant to her. In the period before the shooting, Hinckley's behavior became increasingly focused on his obsession. He followed news about President Reagan, obtained a firearm, traveled to Washington, and positioned himself near the location where Reagan was expected to appear. In 1981, the shooting took place and Hinckley was arrested. In 1982, his trial began and the insanity defense became the center of the case. The attack injured 4 people. President Ronald Reagan was struck by a bullet that enters his chest and injured his lung. Press Secretary James Brady suffered a devastating head injury and was permanently disabled. Police officer Thomas Delanthe was shot in the neck, and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarty was wounded while moving into the line of fire. After the shooting, Hinckley was arrested immediately and the firearm was recovered, but the investigation did not end with proving who fired the shots. The much more complicated question was why he did it and what was happening psychologically when he did it. Hinckley underwent psychiatric evaluation and experts examined his psychological history, behavior, statements, and mental condition. During the trial, psychiatric experts gave conflicting opinions about whether he met the legal standard for insanity. The defense argued that Hinckley was suffering from a serious mental disorder and that his mental condition affected his ability to understand the wrongfulness of his conduct. The prosecution, however, pointed toward evidence of planning and purposeful behavior. He had traveled to Washington, he had waited for the president, and he had carried out a specific sequence of action. So the courtroom was essentially confronted with 2 competing interpretations. Was this the behavior of a person deliberately carrying out a criminal plan? Or was this the plan itself the product of a severely disturbed mental state? Hinckley's behavior displayed several features that attracted psychiatric attention, including obsessive thinking, depression, disturbed beliefs, and impaired judgment. His fixation on Jodie Foster was particularly significant. He developed the belief that shooting the president would impress her, a belief that appears irrational when viewed from ordinary reality. That's why forensic psychological assessment focus on the person's mental state at the time of the offense, rather than simply asking whether they have ever experienced mental illness. The expert evidence in Hinckley's trial became extremely important because psychiatrists disagreed about whether his mental condition satisfied the legal insanity standard. On June 21, 1982, the jury found John Hinckley Jr. not guilty by reason of insanity. This does not mean that the jury believed nothing had happened. It meant that, under the legal standard being applied at the time, the jury concluded that Hinckley's mental condition made him legally not responsible for the offences. He was subsequently committed to psychiatric care rather than sent to an ordinary prison. The verdict created enormous public controversy. So the impact of the Hinckley case extended far beyond Hinckley himself. It changed the legal landscape surrounding mental illness and criminal responsibility in the United States. Following the verdict, Hinckley spent decades in psychiatric care, particularly at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. His story then became a long-term example of how rehabilitation can occur within the forensic mental health system. Over the years, restrictions were gradually reduced as mental health professionals and the court assessed his risk and progress. In 2016, he was permitted to leave St. Elizabeth under extensive condition, and on June 15, 2022, he was released from remaining court supervision after the court concluded that he had successfully completed the required observation period and was no longer considered a danger to himself or others. In recent years, he has also pursued music and art and has maintained an online presence. He currently has an active YouTube channel with over 44,000 subscribers. So, why does this case still matter more than 4 decades later? Because it sits at the intersection of law, psychology, and public safety. It also exposed a major problem with courtroom expert testimony. Before the 1984 reform, psychiatric experts could directly give opinions concerning whether a defendant met the legal insanity standard. After the reforms, federal law placed greater limit on that kind of ultimate issue testimony. Today, forensic mental health professionals can provide evidence about psychological functioning and mental state. There are three major lessons we can take from the Hinckley case. First, mental illness does not automatically excuse criminal behavior. Second, medical insanity and legal insanity are different concepts. And third, forensic psychology exists precisely because human behavior cannot always be understood through a simple guilty or innocent framework. The Hinckley case forced the legal system to confront an uncomfortable question. How should society respond when someone commits a serious offense while experiencing a severe mental disturbance? There is no simple answer. Justice must consider the victim, the public, and the rights of the accused, and the possibility of treatment and rehabilitation. The information presented in this case study has been compiled from historical records, legal documents, government sources, forensic and psychiatric literature, and archival material relating to the Hinckley case. Some particularly important resources include the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, U.S. Department of Justice material on the Insanity Defense Reform Act, Federal Rule of Evidence, and historical court records. A crime tells us what a person did. Forensic psychology asks us to understand what was happening in the mind while they did it. The John Hinckley Jr. case reminds us that justice is not always simply about punishment, and sometimes it is finding a balance between accountability, treatment, and rehabilitation. Because understanding the mind behind an offense does not mean excusing the offense, it means understanding the evidence well enough to pursue justice. Thank you for watching.